It was a warm, sunny afternoon when a family decided to gather in their backyard for a much-needed barbecue. The air was filled with the scent of sizzling burgers, the laughter of children playing, and the gentle hum of a quiet neighborhood. It seemed like just another peaceful weekend in a suburban community where everyone was minding their own business. But little did they know, this simple get-together was about to set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. As family enjoyed their meal, a neighbor, irritated by sound of laughter and smoke wafting from the grill, couldn't let it go. This neighbor had always had a problem with the family. There had been little jabs here and there, an occasional scowl, a curt remark, but on this particular day, frustration reached its boiling point. Without any hesitation, this neighbor decided to make a call to the police, claiming that the barbecue was disrupting the peace. A false accusation that would soon set the stage for a dramatic turn of events. Now, imagine the tension in that moment. The family, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes, continued their celebration. The sound of sirens started to grow louder, slowly cutting through the sound of the grill and the kids playing. Their peaceful afternoon was about to be interrupted by an unexpected visitor, and this wasn't just anyone. It was the police. But as the officers arrived, something was different. The energy wasn't one of confrontation, but rather something strange, something that felt off. The family was calm, even welcoming, trying to explain that everything was perfectly fine. The neighbor, however, had already made their case, painting a picture of noise and disruption. Yet the officers, seeing no immediate reason for concern, didn't seem convinced. The situation seemed like it would quickly fizzle out. But that wasn't the end of it. What happened next would have everyone shaking their heads in disbelief. Karma, as they say, has a funny way of striking when you least expect it. The neighbor, who thought their complaint would go unnoticed, suddenly found themselves at the center of an even bigger drama, one that would turn the tables in ways they never saw coming. As the officers began to leave, a small detail emerged that would change everything. The air was thick with uncertainty. The family, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, couldn't help but feel like there was more to this story than met the eye. Why had the neighbor gone so far to cause trouble? And what would happen next? The truth was unfolding in a way no one could have predicted, and it was only just beginning to get interesting. Stay tuned, because the twist that's coming will leave you stunned. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. The neighbor's actions weren't without consequences, and what they had set in motion was about to catch up to them fast. The sun hung low in the sky as the police car slowly pulled away, its sirens no longer echoing in the distance. The family remained standing in their backyard, eyes still lingering on the spot where the officers had just been. There was a strange mixture of confusion and unease in the air. The kids had stopped playing, sensing the tension that had suddenly entered their once carefree afternoon. The adults exchanged glances, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't the first time they dealt with a neighbor like this, someone who seemed to take issue with their very presence. But it was the first time it had escalated to this level. The complaints had always been small before: too much noise, too many cars in the driveway, a fence that was a few inches too tall. But today, things had crossed a line. The call to the police, a call built on a false accusation, felt like an attack. But why? What could have caused their neighbor to make such a drastic move? The family had lived in the neighborhood for years, long enough to know that it wasn't always the most welcoming place. It was the type of area where the houses were close together, but the neighbors kept to themselves. There was an unspoken agreement: mind your own business, and you wouldn't have any trouble. But there were always a few exceptions, people who seemed to take issue with everything. For this particular neighbor, though, things seemed different. They hadn't just called the police, they had acted with a level of aggression that hinted at something deeper. It wasn't long before the family started piecing together small details. There had been strange looks exchanged in the past, whispers behind closed doors, and even the occasional awkward silence when the family would pass by this neighbor's house. Nothing overtly hostile, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort that they couldn't quite shake. And now this? The call to the cops? It felt like more than just a complaint. It felt like a deliberate attempt to disrupt their lives, to paint them as a problem in the neighborhood. The family tried to shake off the tension, but it was hard. The quiet after the police left felt like an oppressive weight, sitting heavily on their shoulders. As the evening went on, they tried to return to their barbecue, but the fun and laughter had been replaced with an uncomfortable silence. The kids had gone inside to play video games, and the adults sat around the table, quietly sipping their drinks and exchanging uneasy glances. But even as they sat there, trying to relax, they knew that something wasn't right. There was more to this story than they realized. They could feel it in their bones. It wasn't just about the barbecue, or the noise, or even the call to the police. There was something deeper at play, something personal, something that had been building for a long time without them even knowing. As night fell and the last of the barbecue was packed away, the family sat on their porch, watching the stars appear one by one. They spoke in hushed tones, trying to make sense of the day's events. It was clear that they couldn't just let this go. Something needed to be done. But what? How could they confront a neighbor who had so clearly made their life harder? How could they fight back against someone who had used the police to cause trouble? The next few days felt strangely quiet, as if the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. The family went about their daily routines, but there was always an underlying sense of unease. Every time they stepped outside, it felt like their eyes were being watched, like there was someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. They knew it wasn't just in their heads. The neighbor had made their move, and now they were waiting for a reaction. Then, a strange thing happened. The family received a letter in the mail. It was brief, but chilling. It was from the neighbor, and it read simply, "You won't get away with this." The words felt like a threat, and they sent a chill down their spines. What did it mean? What had the neighbor meant by it? The letter wasn't signed, but it was clear who it was from. The handwriting was unmistakable. The family discussed the letter in hushed tones, trying to figure out what action they should take. Should they contact the police again? Should they confront the neighbor directly? But every option felt like it could make things worse. What if the neighbor had more ammunition? What if they were prepared for a confrontation? The tension continued to build as the days passed. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any stranger, they did. One afternoon, the family was out in their backyard again, this time just enjoying a quiet moment together. The kids were playing on the swings, and the adults were sitting on the patio, talking. But suddenly, there was a loud bang. The family froze, unsure of what had happened. Was it fireworks? A car backfiring? Or something worse? They rushed outside to see what had caused the noise, and that's when they saw it. Their neighbor's car, parked in their driveway, had been severely damaged. It wasn't just a fender bender or an accident. No, this was intentional. The side of the car had been scratched and dented, the windows smashed in. The damage was so severe that it was clear it had been done with a deliberate, angry force. But what shocked them even more than the damage was what they found next. Taped to the windshield was another note, this time with a much more explicit message. It read, "You're next." The family stood in stunned silence, the weight of the message sinking in. It was clear now that the neighbor wasn't just trying to cause trouble, they were actively targeting them. The threats were escalating, and there was no telling what would happen next. The sense of danger was palpable, but the family couldn't help but feel like they were being watched from every corner of the neighborhood. The feeling of being trapped was overwhelming. They immediately called the police, but this time it was different. The officers who arrived were visibly shaken by the extent of the damage. This wasn't just a petty dispute anymore. The police officer who took the report assured them that they would investigate the matter and take the appropriate steps. But even as they spoke, the family couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. The neighbor had clearly crossed the line, but the question was, would they stop now, or was this just the beginning? As the officers left, they noticed something strange. The lights in the neighbor's house were on, and they could see movement inside, but the curtains were drawn, hiding the view from the street. It was as if the neighbor was watching, waiting for the next move. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt like the entire neighborhood was on edge. That night, the family couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind felt like a warning. They kept their lights off, their doors locked, and their eyes glued to the windows, waiting for any sign of movement. But the night passed without incident, and morning came with little explanation. The car was still there, its windows shattered, its body a canvas of rage. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. What the family didn't know was that their neighbor's plan was far from finished. There was still more to uncover, more secrets buried beneath the surface. And as the days passed, the mystery deepened. Why had this neighbor taken such extreme measures? And what were they planning next? The family was left in suspense, unsure of what their next move should be. But they knew one thing for sure: things were about to get a lot more complicated. The days following the vandalism were filled with a mix of dread and disbelief. The family couldn't understand why their neighbor had taken things this far. What had begun as a simple, if uncomfortable, situation had quickly escalated into something far darker. The note on the windshield had made one thing clear: this wasn't a random act of aggression. Their neighbor was targeting them, and it felt like a personal vendetta. But why? The suspicion weighed heavily on them as they went about their daily routines. They couldn't help but feel like they were living under constant surveillance. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister, and every car that passed by their house sent a ripple of anxiety through them. The constant fear of what might happen next became suffocating. Was it really just about a neighbor's petty complaints, or was there something more behind this? In the quiet moments when they were alone, they began to wonder if they had missed something that might explain the neighbor's behavior. It wasn't like they had ever caused any major trouble in the neighborhood. They had always tried to stay out of everyone's way, respected the boundaries, and kept to themselves. So why now? What had pushed this person over the edge? One evening, as the family sat in the living room, trying to focus on something other than the looming tension, one of them remembered something strange. A few weeks before the police had been called, they had noticed that the neighbor had been acting even more distant than usual. It had been subtle at first, the way they would quickly turn away when they passed by, or the way their smile didn't quite reach their eyes when they exchanged pleasantries. But now, thinking back, the signs had been there. Had the neighbor always been this bitter? Or was something else going on? The thought lingered, and the family started looking at the situation through a different lens. Perhaps it wasn't just a personal vendetta. What if there was something more at play? What if the neighbor had been pushed to the brink by something they hadn't even known about? It was possible that there was some hidden aspect of the neighbor's life, something they hadn't been privy to, that could explain their strange behavior. This new perspective didn't make the threats any less terrifying, but it added a layer of complexity to the situation. The family couldn't help but feel sympathy for the neighbor, even as they feared them. Maybe there was something they could do, something that could help ease the tension. But at the same time, the fear of making things worse hung over them like a dark cloud. What if trying to understand their neighbor only made things spiral further out of control? In the meantime, the neighborhood had grown quieter. No one spoke about the incident. No one seemed willing to acknowledge the tension that had settled over the area. It was as if everyone had agreed to pretend nothing had happened, as if ignoring the issue would somehow make it go away. But the family couldn't just pretend. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. Every sound, every glance, Every movement felt like part of an invisible war that no one was willing to talk about. Then, one afternoon, the family received another unexpected visit. It wasn't the police this time, but a letter, the same handwriting, the same chilling message. But this time, the words were different. "You don't know who I am, but you will soon." The letter was cryptic, but the weight of its implications was clear. It wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. The neighbor was no longer playing small games. The stakes had been raised, and the family now knew that the danger wasn't just about the car or the property damage. It was something deeper, something more dangerous. The letter wasn't just a message, it was a challenge. It was clear that the neighbor was daring them to take action, to confront them, to respond. But what could they do? How could they fight against something that felt so intangible, so menacing? The fear of retaliation kept them from reaching out, but the uncertainty of not knowing what would happen next was eating away at them. Each day felt like it was building towards something. But what? Meanwhile, the neighbors' behavior had taken another odd turn. They started leaving their house more frequently, always at odd hours, always when the family least expected it. It was as if they were deliberately avoiding contact, staying just out of reach. Every time the family saw them from a distance, they couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about the way they moved, something lurking beneath the surface. It was as if they were hiding something more than just their anger. It wasn't just about the neighbor anymore. The entire neighborhood felt different. The once familiar streets now felt foreign, like a maze of uncertainty. The family had grown distrustful of everyone. Even the friends they had once known felt distant. Could they trust anyone, or was everyone silently judging them? Were they the ones who were being unreasonable? Or was it possible that the entire neighborhood was complicit in what was happening, either out of fear or indifference? With each passing day, the tension only deepened. And just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, the family began to notice something else. The small things that had once felt insignificant, a misplaced piece of trash in the yard, a car parked too close to their driveway, a faint shadow passing by their window, now took on new meaning. They couldn't stop thinking that it was all connected. That every detail, every glance, every seemingly innocuous event was part of the same unsettling pattern. They began to question their own instincts. Were they overreacting? Was the neighbor really capable of the threats they had made? Or were they simply misinterpreting the signs? The paranoia began to set in, and every decision they made, whether to stay home or go out, whether to call the police again or handle it themselves, felt like it could make the difference between safety and danger. And still, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time they looked outside, every time they stepped onto their porch, they felt the weight of someone's gaze upon them. It was like an invisible force was holding them in place, making them second-guess their every move. The feeling of being trapped in a nightmare, unsure of where the next blow would come from, was unbearable. And yet, the family couldn't escape. They had no choice but to wait, to watch, to hope that things would somehow resolve themselves. But deep down, they knew that the situation was only getting worse. The storm was coming, and they had no idea how it would all play out. But as the days wore on, the neighbors' behavior began to change once again. There were subtle shifts, things that didn't quite add up. The once constant tension seemed to loosen, just a little, as if something had shifted in their own life. But the family couldn't quite put their finger on it. Were they finally cracking under the pressure, or was there something else at play? And if so, what was it? The mystery only deepened, and with it, the uncertainty. What was the neighbor really after? And could they stop it before it was too late? The days following the cryptic letter dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. The constant anxiety was taking its toll on the family, but there was no escape. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of a light in the distance, seemed to amplify their growing unease. The feeling of being under constant surveillance had intensified, and with it, the weight of uncertainty grew unbearable. They couldn't shake the sensation that something big was about to happen. But what exactly, they couldn't say. The neighbor's odd behavior had only escalated, but what was even more unnerving was how unpredictable it had become. One moment they would be seen standing in their yard, staring directly at the family's home, and the next, they would disappear for days on end, leaving behind a silence that was almost deafening. It was as though they were playing some kind of game, but the family couldn't figure out the rules. The tension reached its peak one afternoon when the family noticed that the neighbor's car, which had always been parked in the same spot, was suddenly gone. The driveway was empty. At first, it seemed like a small change, but for some reason, it sent a chill down their spines. It was as if the calm before the storm had arrived, and the absence was more unsettling than any presence could have been. With the neighbor's movements becoming more erratic, the family found themselves torn between two thoughts: one, that they needed to act, and two, that they were too afraid of what could happen if they did. The idea of confronting the neighbor seemed like an impossible task, and yet they couldn't ignore the fact that things were becoming far more dangerous. Something had to give, but the family couldn't figure out how to make the first move. The fear of making the wrong choice loomed large. Then, on a night that felt unusually still, they heard it. The sound of footsteps outside, soft but deliberate. They froze. The family held their breath, eyes darting toward the window, hoping they were wrong. But no, there it was again, closer this time. A shadow crossed the yard, moving toward their house. Every instinct told them to stay inside, to hide, but curiosity tugged at them. Were they being targeted once more, or was this the beginning of something even more disturbing? The footsteps stopped just outside their door, and for a moment, everything went completely silent. The family's hearts pounded in their chests, and they exchanged nervous glances, not daring to make a sound. It felt like hours before anyone moved. Finally, the silence was broken when a sharp knock echoed through the house. It was a sound that carried through the walls, vibrating with tension. The family's hearts skipped a beat. Who was it? It could have been the police again, or worse, the neighbor. But why now? What did they want? Every fiber of their being screamed not to answer, but at the same time, they knew they couldn't ignore it. Someone was out there, and it was clear that the confrontation they had been avoiding had finally arrived. The father, heart racing, slowly made his way to the door. The others stayed behind him, close enough to react but far enough to stay out of sight. As he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle, and for a moment, he hesitated. What if this was a trap? What if this was the moment things turned violent? But his determination to put an end to the uncertainty won out, and he opened the door. What he saw made his blood run cold. Standing in the doorway was the neighbor, but they weren't alone. A second figure stood behind them, shadowed and menacing. The neighbor's eyes were hard, unreadable, and the air between them crackled with a tension that had only built over the past few weeks. The family tried to read their expressions, but there was no warmth, no recognition, only a coldness that sent a shiver down their spines. The neighbor spoke, their voice low and almost mocking. I told you this wouldn't end well, didn't I? Before anyone could respond, the figure behind them moved, stepping closer into the light. It was a face they didn't recognize. A stranger. Someone new to the neighborhood, but their presence was so deliberate, so out of place, that it felt as though they had been waiting for this moment to unfold. The family stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Why were they here? What had they come to do? The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The father opened his mouth to speak, but the neighbor cut him off with a raised hand. You think you're safe, don't you? But you're not. You never were. Their voice was steady, but there was something behind it, something far more sinister than just a grudge. The family looked at one another, a mixture of confusion and dread. What did this mean? Was the neighbor's vendetta truly over something as small as a barbecue? Or was this just the beginning of something darker, something that they had unwittingly set into motion? The stranger behind the neighbor stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "We've been watching," he said, his tone flat but firm. "Everything you do. Everything you say. You think you've been living your life without consequence, but you're wrong." The words hung in the air, echoing around them. It wasn't just a threat, it felt like a declaration of war. The family couldn't make sense of it. Who were these people? And why had they been targeting them? The father's pulse quickened as he took a step back, his mind racing for an answer that didn't seem to exist. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his voice shaking despite his attempts to stay calm. But the neighbor simply smirked, as if they were enjoying the discomfort, the fear that was radiating from the family. "That's the thing," the neighbor replied with a hint of satisfaction in their voice. "You'll find out soon enough." And with that, the door slammed shut, leaving the family standing there, heartbeats thundering in their ears. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was clear that the game had changed. They were no longer just dealing with a neighbor, they were facing something far more dangerous. But what would happen next? What was the true cost of standing up to someone so relentless, so full of rage? The uncertainty gnawed at them, and the dread grew heavier with each passing second. The family knew that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Something far more dangerous was coming, and they weren't ready for it. But would they ever be? The family stood in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. The door had slammed with such finality, leaving them alone with their thoughts, surrounded by an unsettling quiet. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity, each of them lost in their own confusion and fear. What had just happened? What did the neighbor mean by soon enough? The unanswered questions churned in their minds, gnawing at them with growing intensity. It wasn't long before they heard a noise, faint but unmistakable, a sound that immediately set their nerves on edge. At first they thought it was nothing, just the wind or maybe the creak of an old pipe, but then it came again, clearer this time. A car. Slowly rolling down the street, its headlights casting long shadows across the front yard. But this was no ordinary car. The engine hummed low, almost too quiet, as if trying to remain unnoticed. The father, still shaken from the previous exchange, stepped cautiously toward the window. He hesitated, his hand hovering near the curtain, but then, driven by a gut feeling, he pulled it back. What he saw took his breath away. A black SUV sat parked across the street, its windows tinted so dark it was impossible to see inside. But it wasn't just the vehicle that caught his attention, it was the people standing around it. There were two figures near the car, but they weren't alone. Behind them, partially obscured by the shadow of the vehicle, was a third person, someone much larger, someone whose presence seemed to loom over the others. The father's heart raced as he recognized one of the figures, the neighbor. But it wasn't just the neighbor. With them stood someone he had never seen before. A tall man, dressed in a suit, his face unreadable but his posture rigid and imposing. The way he stood, so still and deliberate, made him seem like a figure out of a nightmare. The air around him was charged with something ominous, like a storm that was waiting to break. The family was already on edge, but now it felt like they were in the middle of something far bigger than they could have imagined. The man in the suit was clearly not just a passerby or a neighbor's acquaintance. He was here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it wasn't good. The family exchanged nervous glances, their earlier fears about the situation now seeming small compared to the real threat that was unfolding before them. The stranger's presence added a new layer to the tension, as though he was the catalyst for something even darker. His cold, calculating demeanor suggested he was someone with power, someone who didn't make idle threats. And as the family watched from behind the curtain, it became clear that they were being watched right back. Every move they made was being observed, every expression red. The father pulled back from the window, his breath shaky as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. "We have to do something," he said, his voice tight with urgency. But what could they do? The situation had already escalated so far beyond their control, and they were out of their depth. The neighbor, the stranger, the strange car, it all pointed to something far more dangerous than any petty neighborhood dispute. The mother, shaking her head, tried to steady herself. "We can't just sit here," she whispered, the panic evident in her voice. "But we can't just walk into this either. We don't know who they are or what they want." And that was the crux of the problem. They didn't know anything about these people, about their motives, or what they were capable of. All they knew was that they had been dragged into something they couldn't escape. The stakes were higher now. What had begun as a simple altercation over a family barbecue had spiraled into a battle they hadn't signed up for. Just as the tension reached its peak, a new sound broke through the air, loud, almost deafening. The unmistakable screech of tires cutting through the night echoed down the street, followed by the distant sound of a door slamming. The family looked at each other, eyes wide with fear, as they realized that the situation was about to get worse. The SUV was now pulling away from the curb, the headlights flashing brightly as it sped down the street. But something was different about this time. The car didn't turn the corner and disappear like it had before. Instead, it stopped. Right in front of their house. The engine revved loudly, and for a moment, it seemed like the world had frozen. What were they planning? Who were these people? The family's hearts raced as the figure in the suit emerged from the SUV. He moved with purpose, his every step deliberate, as if he had a clear goal in mind. The father felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He had to act, but what could he do against someone like this? Someone who clearly had power, resources, and no intention of backing down. As the man in the suit walked toward the front door, the family recoiled in shock. This wasn't just some random encounter. This wasn't a simple confrontation over a misunderstanding. This was personal. And the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. Just as the man reached the door, the family heard the unmistakable sound of a phone vibrating on the table. The father's hand instinctively moved to grab it, but before he could even check, the doorbell rang. 3 sharp, demanding rings, cutting through the silence like a knife. The tension in the house had never been more palpable. With one hand on the phone, the other gripped the door frame, the family was paralyzed. They knew that whatever came next could change everything. Would this man be the one to end their nightmare, or was he just the beginning of something even darker? As the father stood frozen, staring at the door, the phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. But it wasn't just any number. It was the same code that had been in the letter. The same series of numbers that had haunted them for days. The family was now caught in a web far beyond their understanding, their every move being watched, their every decision leading them closer to an unknown conclusion. And as the man's fist raised to knock, the phone rang once more, a final reminder that they weren't alone. That they never had been. The doorbell rang again, its sound almost deafening in the silence that had taken over the house. The father, still clutching the phone in his hand, exchanged a quick glance with his family. They all knew this was the moment everything would either come crashing down, or they would finally be able to break free from this nightmare. With a deep breath, the father moved toward the door. His hand hovered over the handle for a second before he steeled himself and opened it. Standing on the other side was the man in the suit, his presence commanding the space. His cold gaze flicked over the father before settling on the family, sizing them up with an unsettling calmness. "Good evening," the man said, his voice smooth and composed, but it carried a layer of menace underneath. "I believe we need to talk." The father stood his ground, unwilling to show any fear, though inside his heart pounded in his chest. "What do you want from us?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a long, deliberate look at the family, as if weighing their worth in some invisible way. Then, without warning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope, handing it to the father. It was sealed with a wax stamp, something that immediately raised the tension in the room. "Open it," the man instructed. The father, though confused, felt an urgency in the man's tone that told him he had no choice but to obey. He tore open the envelope and pulled out a piece of paper, his eyes scanning the words. It wasn't a letter, it was a legal document. A document that detailed the ownership of the house, a house that, according to this paper, was no longer theirs. The shock hit him like a punch to the gut. The father's hands trembled as he read the lines over and over again. The property, it seemed, was being claimed by someone else. But who? And why? The family had lived here for years. This house was their home, their sanctuary. They had always paid their dues, kept to themselves, and never caused trouble. Yet here they were, faced with the cold reality that this stranger, this imposing man, was now taking everything from them. Why? The mother finally spoke, her voice breaking through the thick silence. "Why are you doing this to us?" The man in the suit's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not personal," he said, his words slicing through the air. "This was never about you." The family stood frozen, struggling to comprehend what was unfolding in front of them. This wasn't a neighborhood dispute. This wasn't just a clash over a barbecue. This was something far more sinister, something tied to forces beyond their control. Just as the father opened his mouth to protest, the phone in his hand buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. His heart skipped a beat as he looked down at the screen. The message was brief, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. It was from an unknown number, just a single line of text: "It's not what it seems." Before he could process the meaning of the cryptic message, the man in the suit gave a small nod. "This doesn't have to go any further. Just accept the terms, and everything will be resolved." But the father's mind was racing. Something wasn't adding up. His gut told him that there was more to this story, more to this man, more to the neighbor's strange behavior, and more to the mystery that had unfolded over the past few days. He couldn't just give in, not without understanding the full picture. He needed answers. "I'm not signing anything," the father said, his voice firm now, despite the turmoil inside him. "You can't just take our home." The man's expression remained calm, almost detached, but there was a flicker of something that suggested this wasn't going to be as simple as walking away. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. "But if that's your choice." Suddenly, without warning, the sound of multiple footsteps echoed from down the street. The family turned toward the noise, eyes wide. More figures were approaching, this time a group of people, all walking in sync, their steps purposeful, their faces hard to read. They were like shadows against the dim streetlights, moving closer with every passing second. The tension in the air was unbearable. The father looked from the man in the suit to the approaching figures, his heart pounding. The realization hit him: this wasn't just about a property dispute. It was about something much bigger. And they were caught right in the middle of it. The man in the suit's eyes flickered toward the approaching group, and for the first time, there was a shift in his demeanor. He stepped back slightly, almost imperceptibly, as though he was reconsidering something. "It's not too late to reconsider," he said, his voice now tinged with uncertainty. But before anyone could say another word, the doorbell rang once more. This time, it wasn't a polite chime, it was a sharp, urgent ring, the kind that made the hairs on the back of the father's neck stand on end. He looked at the door, then at the group of figures who had now stopped in the driveway. The man in the suit stood motionless, as though waiting for something to happen. The father, filled with a sense of dread, turned back to the phone in his hand. The message on the screen hadn't changed, but it was all too clear now. This was the moment of truth. Whatever was going on, whatever game had been played, it was all coming to a head. With a final glance at the man in the suit, the father opened the door. The family had no idea what they were about to face, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. As the door swung wide, the unexpected happened. The people outside weren't strangers at all. They were familiar faces, people the family knew from the neighborhood, neighbors they had never suspected would be involved. And in the hands of one of them was a large envelope, the same wax seal as the one the man had handed over earlier. The father's breath caught in his throat. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but the image they revealed was far more disturbing than anything he could have imagined. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just about a house. It was about a much darker game, one that no one could escape. And then, just as the man in the suit took a step forward, the final twist came. A sharp voice rang out from behind him, and the father's heart sank as the truth finally came to light. The person standing behind the stranger wasn't an ally. It was someone they had trusted, a friend who had been playing them all along. As the final twist settled over the family like a heavy fog, the father's stomach sank. He turned to look at the figure who had spoken out from behind the man in the suit. His eyes went wide with disbelief. It was someone from their neighborhood, someone they had known for years. This person had always been friendly, always had a smile and a casual wave. But now, the look on their face was anything but familiar. There was no warmth, no friendliness, just a cold, calculated stare. The man in the suit didn't move a muscle as the person stepped forward. There was no immediate explanation, just a long, pregnant silence. The father's mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The trust he had in his neighbors, in the community he had built around his family, was shattered in an instant. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the picture they created was far darker than he had ever anticipated. "We didn't want you to find out this way," the neighbor said finally, their voice unnervingly calm. "But it's time you understood the bigger picture." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment, everything felt unreal. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to process what was happening. The neighbor, the person they thought they knew, had been a part of this web of deceit, manipulation, and, it seemed, greed. I don't understand," the father stammered, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to remain composed. "What does this mean? Why are you doing this?" The neighbor looked at him with what could only be described as pity, and then the words spilled out, as though they had been waiting to be said for far too long. "The property isn't just a house to us. It's a key. A key to something much bigger. We needed you to unknowingly participate in the plan. The barbecue, the police, everything, it was all orchestrated. It was all part of the story." The father stood frozen. His mind couldn't comprehend the enormity of what was being said. The barbecue? The cops? It was all a setup? His thoughts scrambled to make sense of the bizarre turn of events. "We needed to create a reason," the neighbor continued. "A reason to drive you out, to get you to play your part without realizing it. This whole thing wasn't about you. It was never personal. It was about what you unknowingly had access to, the history tied to that house. The secrets buried deep within it. Secrets that have been locked away for decades." The father felt as if the ground was slipping beneath him. The sense of betrayal, of being used, gnawed at him. He had been so focused on the injustice of the situation that he hadn't stopped to ask the most important questions. What was it that they were after? What was the real reason behind the sudden attack on their family? What had they been caught up in? The man in the suit stepped forward then, his presence looming over the family. "This house, this land, is part of something that's been hidden for generations. There's a treasure, a hidden truth, that the owners of this land have protected for years. You were never supposed to uncover it, but somehow you did." The father's breath hitched as he recalled moments he had long since forgotten, odd occurrences, strange whispers in the night, and the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but he could never put his finger on it. The house had always felt different, like it had a story to tell, one that no one wanted to hear. You've been planning this for years? The father asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man in the suit nodded. It wasn't always going to be you. But the moment you moved in, we knew you'd be the ones to unlock it. The connection was there, whether you realized it or not. You thought it was just a family barbecue, just a casual get-together. But the energy in that space, it triggered something. It was never about you calling the cops or defending your property. It was about activating the chain of events that would ultimately lead us here. The revelation crashed down like a tidal wave, drowning out everything else. The barbecue, the neighbor's strange behavior, even the cops, it had all been calculated. Nothing was an accident. The father looked at his family, each of them standing in stunned silence, unable to grasp the full scope of what was happening. His heart ached for them, knowing how much they had been put through. But what hurt most was that they had been part of a game they hadn't even known they were playing. But there was one thing the father refused to accept, that they were powerless in this. He looked back at the man in the suit and the neighbor, their smug expressions betraying their belief that they had already won. No, he said, his voice steady, more confident now. You think you've won, but you're wrong. We're not going down like this. The man in the suit raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the father's defiance. You think you can stop us? The father squared his shoulders, standing tall despite the overwhelming odds. You've underestimated us. You think you can manipulate us, but you're wrong. You might have set the stage, but we're the ones who get to decide how this ends. A flicker of something doubt perhaps passed through the man's eyes. He looked to the neighbor, as if silently questioning the wisdom of underestimating their adversaries. But the father didn't give them the chance to react. He turned and motioned for his family to follow him. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they weren't going to let these people take control of their lives anymore. As the father led his family toward the door, the man in the suit took a step forward, but the neighbor raised a hand, signaling him to stop. The neighbor watched the family leave, their expression unreadable. The tension in the air was palpable, but something had changed. The plan, which had seemed flawless just moments ago, was now in jeopardy. The family walked away from the house, from the web of lies and manipulation, determined to find the truth. They knew that the journey ahead would be far from easy, and that more obstacles lay in their path. But as they looked back, they saw the house standing there, its secrets still buried beneath the floorboards, waiting to be uncovered. The story wasn't over. In fact, it had only just begun. As they drove away, the father's thoughts raced. What were the secrets that had been hidden for so long? What did they still not know? And most importantly, what would it take to bring everything into the light? The answers would come, but for now, the family was free. Free from the grip of those who had tried to control them. Free to find the truth. And as they drove into the night, one thing was clear: no one was going to stop them from uncovering the secrets of the past. But the twists weren't over. The true game was still unfolding, and the family was no longer just playing by the rules, they were about to rewrite them.